All right, well, thank you all for coming to this. We wanted to try to get a chance to get more people on campus informed about exactly what is involved in the new funding formula that's been proposed by the Board of Regents. My name is Scott Peters. I'm the chair of the faculty. To my right is Tim Kidd, who's the chair of the Faculty Senate for the Physics Department. I'm in the Political Science Department. And to my left is Joe Corbin. He's the president of the United Faculty. Joe's in the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology Department. And we're each going to talk to you for a few minutes to kind of outline the budget situation, the details of the Regent proposal, and get us started on talking about some of the ramifications of performance-based budgeting. And really quickly, I recognize most of the faces in here, but just so we know who we're talking to, are there any members of the press here by any chance? Okay, thank you. And with that, Tim is going to get us started. So.
Sure. So my portion is going to be basically on the current budget and implications for the near-term budget that UNI is facing right now. If you do have any questions, I go over things, just raise your hand, ask. That's fine by me. Feel free to interrupt. The information is taken from a survey done by the Senate Budget Committee and also by the Board of Regents agenda from last month. So basically take a look at the last 10 or so years of funding levels for UNI, or actually this is for the general fund appropriation. So right now we're kind of getting back to levels near 2001. It's been a decent amount of cuts over the past 15 years. And the other impact of this is that the state, while there's been cuts in many different agencies, the cuts to the Board of Regents in terms of four-year colleges has been a lot more permanent. If you take a look at everything else, things rise, things fall, they kind of go in tandem. But the state appropriation cuts to universities has, well, stayed and has not caught up to things, even community colleges. So if we take a look at the impact this has had on tuition, it's pretty significant. Most of the burden of these kind of cuts has gone onto the students. So tuition's gone up, about, it says 60% here over the past, 20 years. And a lot of that's been the past 10 years, to be honest. So you can kind of see how the decrease in state funding has a direct impact on tuition. Particularly at UNI, tuition's gone up quite a bit, and this is a percentage change. So if you take a look at tuition 2001 to 2015, it's gone up quite a bit. If you include inflation, it's gone up a lot more. So I'd say it's about doubled in the past 15 years. Where inflation's gone up about 35%. And this is a direct impact, of course, on the state appropriations. And these cuts have had a significant impact in general at UNI across board. Every division's had to cut back. This is often experienced in people's positions go unfilled for a decent amount of time. They either don't hire someone to replace staff or kind of wiggle around to delay hiring people. Academic programs, and of course the Price Lab closure. So the Board of Regents has designed this performance-based funding, and a lot of it is supposedly to address the impact on historical underfunding of UNI, and also the latest cuts to all the regions, and even more so changes to per pupil funding. So right now, or I guess it's 2013, the per pupil funding at University of Iowa is about $14,000 per student. At ISU, it's about, $9, and at UNI, it's about $8. So about 150% more than funding per pupil at University of Iowa than ISU or UNI. And I wonder why at this, sudden divergence of funding for ISU might be one of the reasons why this performance-based funding model is getting traction, at least in terms of how the state is funding universities per student. And I think that comes down to taxpayer fairness. If you're sending your kid to UNI, why should you getting half the money as someone who's getting sent to University of Iowa? So the current Board of Regents proposal looks like, well, it's a combination of performance-based funding and overall increase of 1.75%. So I'm not going to go into the details of the model, but if we look at the metrics, the redistribution would be from something where UNI gets a little under 18% of the total state appropriations to something where it gets a little over, or actually almost 22.5%. And so you can see that both ISU and UNI would have an increase of close to 5%, and that would come directly from the money given to University of Iowa. So the Board of Regents, in acknowledging this, has also proposed to backfill the University of Iowa budget. So that means that they would also be proposing that there's an overall increase of 1.75%, an additional $12 million to go to University of Iowa to keep their funding flat, and then divvy up the rest according to the new formula. Now the amount which goes to each university per year is capped. So the total increase, at least according to today's whatever metrics they've run, would be about $20 million to UNI's budget. However, that's going to only be going up about $6 million per year if it's passed. So this slide's kind of busy. Hopefully the numbers can be seen at the bottom. Numbers in red are negative. So what I've taken a look at is the fiscal year 14 budget, the fiscal year 15 budget, that's our current budget, and done an estimate with guidance from people in finance office for the 2016 budget. So what I've done is taken a look at what if there is no increase at all in state appropriations, and any enrollment increase are expected to be small because we have two small classes in the middle of our juniors and sophomores right now, I believe, who are still on the way. So even if we have an increased number of freshmen, we're not going to have an overall increase in enrollment. It's probably going to be pretty flat. So taking into account increase in costs at the same rate as from 14 to 15, I anticipate that we're going to have a pretty big hole in the budget, probably about, it says $8 million at the bottom there. There's a contingency fund included in there, about 1.3, so let's say about $7 million is what we would need to fill up the hole. So this is not just, of course, because of increase in cost. This is because we have change, $4 million to zero. So I should put $4 million in there. But we've lost one-time money of $4 million. So basically costs, I would estimate to go up on the order of $4 million, give or take $1 million, it's fine. But we're also losing, give or take $1 million, right? But we also have lost this one-time money of $4 million. So that's, at least to me, something which is very concerning. That's the kind of thing that could lead to changes at UNI in a bad way. So if we do get performance-based funding, that would keep us at current operating levels. It wouldn't give us a huge boost in how much money we have. Again, from everything I've seen, we're not exactly operating flush. We're kind of getting by. So if the Board of Regents model is accepted in all ways, then we'll be able to get by for one more year, and maybe after that things might start to really improve in our financial outlook. But right now we're hoping to break even. So kind of to summarize everything, the past 15 years, 10 years, whatever, there's been a dramatic impact on all the regions, I would say, but UNI mostly, because half our budget comes from state appropriations. And this has been soaked up by students to a large degree. However, eventually people finally realized that students couldn't pay anymore, looking at the debt load students carry. And so then we lost even more money. So I think we have, in my opinion, personal opinion, a critical funding issue on the order of $8 million for next year. Maybe it's 6, maybe it's 9, it's a lot. And this is both due to one-time funding being stopped and just a normal increase in costs. So this is the proposed fix by the Board of Regents. It'd keep us solvent for next year, and hopefully it would do better things for us in the future. Do you want to take questions now, or should we wait till everybody goes?
No, should we wait till
Yeah,
it goes?
that's what I was gonna say.
So we'll all three go and take questions.
Okay, sure. All right, thanks for your time. And I'll try to-
Microphone transfer here.
I'll figure this out, maybe.
I don't even think that's working, is it? Oh, is it, it's just for the video then, right?
I hope
Is
so.
that what the microphone's
Yeah.
for? Oh.
Because if there's a big speaker up there, I didn't
Yeah.
hear.
Okay. So what is this proposal that the Regents have put forward? First thing you can do is you can imagine the whole pot of money that the Regents are asking for from the legislature. What they're going to do is they're going to divide that pot up and then allocate different parts of that pot of money according to how each university comes out on different measures. So 60% of all the Regents' budget will be allocated to the three universities according to enrollment. And I'll go through each of these measures in more detail. 15% according to what they're calling progress and attainment. 10% according to access. 5% for 5% focused on graduate and professional students, 5% on sponsored research, and 5% based on institutionally specific metrics that have yet to be determined. So if we go through each of those in turn, the resident FTE. So 60% of the money, you can imagine, and I'll actually show you numbers on this in a minute, but if you can imagine 60% of the total amount of money, that's going to be allocated to the three universities based on the full-time undergraduate, full-time equivalency of their student body population. Okay? So when people talk about the money under this plan going to follow Iowa students, it should be stressed that every single measure here that we're looking at here follows Iowa students, but people probably have in mind this first indicator, that money is largely following undergraduate students. Now you'll note there that this is going to be measured on a 3-year rolling average. So in particular spikes for 1 year, up 300 students, up 1,000 students, down 400 students, should be leveled out unless you have 3 bad years in a row or 3 good years in a row. So that kind of helps to identify broad trends rather than make the institution susceptible to short-term spikes. In terms of graduate and professional students, you may have read the article in the Gazette that was published a couple of days ago, I think. A lot of these measures, the Regents set out what the measures would be, and then they said to the three institutions, okay, we need input on exactly, precisely how we're going to measure it. And so as the Gazette article demonstrated, there's been some pretty fierce back and forth arguments about exactly how to divide this up, with each institution naturally arguing for the particular measure that would best suit it. And so with graduate and professional students, the University of Iowa wanted to count all graduate and professional students just according to a head count, regardless of how many credit hours they took. Well, a typical graduate student in, say, political science might take 9 credit hours a semester. A typical graduate student in professional schools would want to take, might take 15 or more credit hours a semester. And the way they were advocating that this be counted, you would actually have counted the professional students in, say, law school or med school as almost more than one graduate student, the way they wanted it to be counted. We're arguing, and what we argued, and the measure that the Regents adopted was that it would be based on credit hour FTE. Student progress. On this, what they're going to do is they're going to look from one fall enrollment report to the other, and they're going to look at the percentage of the class that is moving from freshman status to sophomore status to junior status to senior status. Okay? And then also the number of degrees awarded. Note that this includes transfer credit, AP credit, CLEP credit. Access is based on several different measures of is it the numbers of students or the percentage of your student body? I guess it turns out to be about the same, doesn't it? It's the numbers of in-state students who demonstrate calculated financial need based on the expected family contributions, as well as part-time Pell Grant recipients. And it's calculated in such a way that there's no duplication there. It's based on numbers of minority students, numbers of transfer students, particularly from Iowa community colleges, and numbers of veterans. And again, this is calculated on a 3-year rolling average. Sponsored research is calculated based on how much money each university has both receives from external institutions to support research and also budgets internally to support research. And then finally, that last 5% of institution-specific metrics, the plan is for the first year or maybe 2 years that the institutions, I think, will have time to develop those. And for the first year or 2 years, that 5% will just be divided up proportionally to the rest of it. I think I'm correct about that. And if I'm not, there's a couple people in the room who can correct me there. So, the pot of money I alluded to, the big pot of money, whoops, is that $509 million there, right? So $305 million is about 60% of that total. And you see that of the 60% that gets allotted to based on undergraduate enrollment, the University of Iowa gets 104 million, ISU gets almost 129 million, we get just under 73 million. And so on for each measure. At the very bottom, you can see the reallocation that Tim already mentioned, which is that as this is all currently being calculated, we would get about $6.6 million additional. ISU would get about $6.3 million additional. And the regents have requested additional funding to fund that. So the budget request is actually not to take money from U of I, it's for an additional almost $13 million that would be split up between ISU and UNI under this new plan. So this just hammers that home. Also, it should be pointed out that the numbers you hear floated about the potential reallocation over a 3-year period, roughly for us it would be, we would receive just a little under, I think, $20 million over the 3-year period. That's a maximum because the total amount that can be reallocated is capped at 2% of U of I's general education revenues in order to minimize the impact on U of I. This is just another way to reflect what Tim was telling us, and that is that, I can't aim with this thing. There we go. This is that one-time money that we've been relying upon. You'll recall that a few years ago we asked for $4 million each year over 3 years added to our base budget, so that at the end of 3 years we would have had an additional $12 million added to our base budget. This would have been the 3rd year of that. We got the first year of $4 million. The second year, the legislature said, we're not going to add it to your base budget. We'll give you an extra $10 million over 2 years. So this is the last year of that one-time money. That didn't get added to our base budget. It goes away. And so we would be back at this level. So that's what Tim was saying, where if we don't get additional funding of some kind, we're in a hole, right? So this reflects the amount of money we would get due to the new budgeting model. This reflects the, 1.5% or whatever it is, additional increase that the regents are asking for. 1.75%. Finally, just another way to relate some of the figures that Tim gave you. Under the current system right now, University of Iowa is getting, if you measure their appropriation based upon their in-state students, they're getting over $14,000 per in-state student. We're getting less than $9,000, and this would start to remedy that. So, about to turn things over to Joe here, but what happens next? This now goes to the legislature. It goes to the legislature as an appropriation request. The legislature doesn't actually have to sign off on the individual measures. The legislature simply has to allocate an amount of money to each university. So what the regents want is that the legislature just says, okay, that sounds good to us. Here's how much we'll give to UNI. Here's how much we give to ISU. Here's how much we give to UI. But of course, the legislature can do whatever it wants, right? The legislature can allocate what the regents ask for. It can allocate a different amount. It can do whatever it wants. Do whatever it wants to. And I think it's fair to say that there are political difficulties in getting this through the legislature. There are supporters of the University of Iowa who are opposed to it. And you've all probably been reading the press reports about that. And I anticipate that we'll talk about that during the Q&A. But we can certainly discuss it more. With that, I think I'll turn things over to Joe. Got information. This slideshow will be up on the Senate's website. So there's information there as well to contact the legislature.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, is that okay? All right, good. All right, and Scott, let me make sure now, I'm a little technologically challenged, so all of my classes, it's all on the chalkboard, so I don't do PowerPoint very often. So just hit this arrow to advance it forward?
Yep, that
okay.
works.
All right, so, as the title of my presentation suggests, I'm going to talk about a little bit of, I guess I might say, an alternative perspective to performance-based funding. But I want to start out by saying that, this is not me staking out a position for United Faculty in opposition to performance-based funding, all right? Instead, I think as members of the Academy, we have to be very open to considering a variety of perspectives on important and complex topics, all right? So that's part of what motivates this particular presentation. So as you've heard, a lot of attention given to the revenue difficulties facing our university. And performance-based funding is being conceptualized, presented, and offered as a budget solution. Now there is another possibility, however, that it could be a mission quagmire for our university. So, but before I get into that, I want to say that I think it's important to understand UNI's budget problems are not just the product of revenue issues, but also spending priorities. And so, like all budgets, I have a budget at my home, you have a budget, and so, we take in a certain amount of money. I wish I was as wealthy as Scott is, and I wouldn't have to worry about any of my spending choices, but as it is, I do. And so I can't just go out and buy anything I want to buy because I have a limited amount of revenue, all right? So I think it's important for us to think about, when we're looking at the budget conditions, to examine at least some of the spending priorities for our university. Now let me just say a couple of things before I move forward. The critique you're going to see of the spending priorities at UNI is a critique that could be made at almost any university in America, all right? But we're not at any university, we're at our university. So let's just, now again, as the revenue issues are well known, it's clear that the state legislature, and I would say the governor as well, has failed to provide adequate funding for our university. I think that's a very non-controversial statement, all right? Maybe one of the few I'll make here today. However, the spending priorities receive almost no attention. I rarely hear spending priorities discussed by the administration or by the board or anyone else, frankly, except United Faculty, all right? And I'd like to direct our attention to 3 spending priorities, and that's athletics, administration, and debt. Now, I spent a lot of time going over financial reports, and I can promise you that there are, a lot, and you could do the same thing. You could take a look at the financial reports, and you could find a lot of places where you're saying, why are we spending money on that? What is that? What is that funding for? Do we really need to spend that money? The same as you would do on your personal budget, right? So what I've done is just focus on 3 areas, though. I mean, we could do a much more detailed examination, I assure you. So let's talk about athletics. From 2003 to 2013, you and I diverted $52 million from the General Education Fund to cover shortfalls in athletics. In 2003, 10 years ago, it was $4.15 million diverted. 10 years later, it's 4.19. Now, that's not to say that progress hasn't been made in reducing the diversion of money that goes from general education to athletics, but it's still $4 million. Maybe next year it'll be 3.5, I don't know. But it's a lot of money coming out every year from general education to athletics. Administration. Now, there are a lot of ways, you hear a lot of talk in the media, discussion around the country about bloated administrations in universities and colleges. At the University of Minnesota, they had a huge scandal. It was literally a scandal that took place over the course of a year about bloated administration at that university. So we obviously don't have enough time to have a detailed discussion, but just a couple of things. During the past 10 years, the number of UNI's full-time faculty declined from 673 to 602. During that same time, the number of executive, managerial, professional, and scientific staff increased from 612 to 687. And it's just one indication of a priority that seems to place, placing more spending on the administrative part of the mission than upon the academic part of the mission. It's a spending priority. But now let's look at something that really received almost no attention. In fact, I think this is the first time United Faculty or anybody else has introduced this as part of a university discourse about funding on this campus. Now, all of the buildings and so many of the things that we see here are not paid for directly out of revenue that we get from the legislature. We have to go borrow the money for it. And this is very common in government. It's very common in the public sector, okay? Now from 2003 to 2000, and that doesn't come free, by the way. It's just like the mortgage on my house or your house. You've got to pay interest on that, right? There's a debt associated with that. Now from 2003 to 2013, you and I paid $249 million for the service on our debt alone, okay? Just in the last year, almost $24 million. Now that's all, universities have to borrow money. They're like other large public sector organizations. But when we're borrowing money, we have to borrow it in a way that makes fiscal sense. Now last year, United Faculty hired a public finance person to do an analysis of UNI's debt, okay? I just want to show you, if you look at the debt service percentage, I just talked about the debt service, you look at the debt service percentage across the 3 universities, you can see that of the 3 universities, University of Northern Iowa is considerably higher, all the way down the line. In fact, if you see in fiscal 2006, it was, look at that. That's a huge difference in the percentage that we're paying in debt. But that might be okay, but let's look at something here. And this comes from the University of Virginia's debt service policy. There are ratios for determining in public sector how much debt is enough debt or not, or too much debt, or if you're overburdened in debt. One of these is the debt burden percentage, which is the annual debt divided by total operating cost. And you can see a description of the purpose of that from the University of Virginia's debt policy. The target here is that you should have less than 5. That number should be less than 5%. Okay. Now let's go back. The other 2 universities, they're well beneath that number. Our university is well above it in every instance. That's a budget priority, is debt. We're spending, and what I would suggest to you is that part of what increases in student tuition are paying for, part of what the stagnation of the real wages of faculty is about on this campus is paying for this debt. There's another way to measure this, because one could look at this and say, well, that's just one measure. Well, there's also a debt service coverage ratio. And let's look at this first, and we'll go back to the table. So this ratio measures the university's ability to cover debt service, all right? And you can see the calculations there, operating gains or losses plus operating revenue plus depreciation divided by annual debt service. And here you want to have a number that's beneath 3, okay? And the nice thing about this, oh, how did you hit the laser beam on this deal? This guy right? The top button?
Yep.
Yeah. So the nice thing about this is this ratio is adjusted to reflect any amortizing, non-traditional debt structures that could result in single-year fluctuations, all right? Now, let's look at this. You can see here that our university is considerably beneath that number. We don't even come close to 3 in any of those years, but if you look at the other universities, they're doing pretty well, okay, in terms of their debt service coverage ratio. They're not facing the debt dilemmas that we are, okay? So, I just want to say that, again, the tremendous support that we're seeing for performance-based funding is based largely on the fact that, or the argument that we're facing a revenue problem. We are facing a revenue problem, but we're not just facing a revenue problem. We're facing a spending problem as well. A problem of spending that is not directly connected to the core mission of this university, which is excellence in education, research, and service. All right, so let's talk about performance-based funding research. And I've read a considerable amount of the current research on performance-based funding. And it's very interesting, okay? So this is a great article that was published in AAUP journal, Academe. And there are a lot of findings from this research. This was kind of a historical analysis on the factors that were causing this kind of, again, this resurgence. Because this isn't the first time we've had performance-based funding. A lot of people call this PBF 2.0, version 2. Because performance-based funding, there was an effort to bring it around, I guess in the 90s. Didn't do so well. They tried it out at the University of Alabama, and University of South Carolina. After 5 years, they dropped the entire project. So one of the findings from McClendon and Hearn's analysis, this is a very interesting article, is that PBF tends to be a product of broader ideological contests rather than concerns for improvement in higher education. And one of the things you notice, as political scientists like Scott will notice, is that when you first see PBF moving up and across the university, it's starting primarily in red states, not in the blue states. And what we're starting to see now is the purple states like Iowa are starting to encounter these PBF models. So what they're saying here is a lot of this has more to do with politics than it has to do with improving the quality of our universities. In this article, this is a really great article from the University of Alabama, found no compelling evidence between PBF and improved student outcomes at this time. And this is one of the things that the performance-based funding says over and over again, is there's no real evidence that performance-based funding helps to achieve goals in terms of retention, graduation rates, credits earned, that sort of thing. 2 of these authors, by the way, are from Iowa State University. I don't recall which 2 right now. 2 of them are. Now this is a policy brief out of Columbia University. Performance-based funding can have troublesome unintended impacts, including grade inflation, lowering of academic standards. They also say it's important to include colleges and universities in the design of performance-based funding, and this is really important, that performance-based funding should be insulated from the state revenue cycle, okay? But that's exactly the opposite of what's happening in Iowa. This article by Mayo, we should actively involve stakeholders in the funding design model. That's not happening. I mean, if you call stakeholders, for instance, leaders of the faculty senate, the faculty senates at our universities were not involved in the design of these models, this model. Should recognize individualized differences among schools with separate funding formulas or different weighted metrics. But that's exactly the opposite of what happens here. Scott's already pointed out the metrics that he's presented to you are for all 3 schools. So here are some of the common points that are found in the research. First, there's almost no extant research that indicates that the current PBF models are effective at achieving their stated goals. Where PBF is implemented, there should be a learning year. So one of the common recommendations of the research is, if you're going to do PBF, fine enough. Fine, go ahead and do it. But the first year, don't put any money on the table. See how it works, right? Or alternatively, here's another thing. Start off with lesser amounts. When we first, United Faculty first began our discussions with President Root about this, President Root's view was, and I don't know what his view is today, but his view at the time was, let's start out, if we're going to do PBF money, let's not do 100% of our funding tied to it the way we're doing now. Let's do it more like, 10, 15%. Let's put our toe in the water and see what happens here, which is the most common way to approach PBF. They should be designed to fit the specific missions of universities and should be linked explicitly to higher education goals. And I want you to look at this very important statement. I think it's one of the most important statements in all the research. PBF should not be used as a remedy for problems related to state appropriations. That's exactly what we're doing here. Okay? So, none of this is to say, again, I'm not staking out a position in opposition to this. I'm saying we should all know what we're dealing with here. It's like that story about the scorpion and the frog I told at the last faculty meeting, okay? Just so everybody knows, okay, what we're partnering up here with. So UNI is facing significant budget problems that demand immediate attention. Let me just say this. We can't solve the spending problems that I've talked about here now. We can't solve those. Solving those spending problems could take years, so that's not going to happen. So we've got a revenue problem that is indeed is pressing on us right now. So PBF is one possible resolution. But what is it going to do for the faculty? It's going to significantly increase the burdens upon faculty to be responsible for this university's revenue. Because it will be the faculty who are responsible for attracting those in-state students. It will be the faculty who are responsible for getting those students to achieve their credit hours, to retain the university, to graduate. That's going to be on the faculty. Well, the faculty of this university, hasn't ever, shirked away from those kind of obligations or responsibilities. But it's going to be more. This is going to be a bigger burden for faculty, especially in the classroom. It's also going to require our faculty senates to be more proactive guardians of the quality of our academic programs. Because if we get performance-based funding, part of the risk, as the research says, is a degradation to the quality of our programs. The president of of the American Association of University Professors, Rudy Fichtenbaum, has described performance-based funding as no child left behind writ large for universities and colleges. Okay? So and as a faculty and as a senate, our job is to be guardians of the quality of our academic mission. Well, there is a more parsimonious solution because we say that, oh my gosh, that's all we can do is performance-based funding. But a member of the performance-based funding task force appointed by the board later, he resigned from that board because he said, well, when we got together to discuss performance-based funding, we never considered any other options. But there are other options. One option would be for have an agreement by the Board of Regents and the legislature to just provide a permanent base allocation to UNI that equates to 82% of the state's allocation for Iowa's universities. So just take those percentage numbers that are here and say, okay, that's going to be those. You could do that. There's nothing that prevents anybody from doing that except the goodwill and the cooperation among the leadership of each university. Now, I've said before, if it was me, what I'd do is I'd lock them in a room together and tell them they don't come out until they get that agreement. And actually, it doesn't have to be, UNI doesn't have to be in it. What we do is we give UNI 22%. We put President Mason, President Leith in the room and say, you get to work out the rest. And if you can't do it, we'll find someone who will. We'll find someone who will. Because here's what's going to happen. Scott alluded to the conflict that's already brewing between the universities. And when we go into the legislative session, it's going to be worse. Sunday, I talked to a state senator on Sunday who's the chair of an important Senate committee that will be considering this. And I'm telling you, they're gearing up. Okay? This is not just going to go down easy in the legislature. So we have to make a choice. Now, for United Faculty, I said yesterday, we're on the horns of a moral dilemma. I know we need the money. We're in bargaining right now. I know we need the money. Okay? And so my responsibility as president of United Faculty is to try to have a robust revenue for our faculty so that we can protect wages and protect benefits. But I think we should all be very concerned about what this will mean once we buy in this model. if we buy into it again, I think it's going to put a huge responsibility on the leaders of the Faculty Senate to protect the quality of our programs. Okay, I think that's all I have. That's it. And so,
Time for questions. Anyone want to get us started?
no questions?
Wow, we explained it perfectly. I feel like I'm in class.
Well, I have a question. I have a question for the faculty members here. I mean, if I were to send out a survey question to the faculty, I'd say, look, here are the downsides to performance-based funding. Here's the upside. The upside is, we stand to be able to protect wages and benefits. And I would like to hear from some faculty members how you would resolve that dilemma, what that means to you. No? Yeah.
What's the chance of this last idea for us?
Slim and none. Slim was on the train to California, as my granddaddy used to say. But you don't know when they get into conflict. If people get desperate enough, they might decide to look for the most simple solution.
I guess, so this is my take on the politics of this, okay? And I want to stress that this is not, coming from the administration or from our lobbyists. But my take on the politics of this is that, first of all, we looked back a few years ago, it was hard to get $12 million over 3 years. Now the regents are asking for $12 million in 1 year to essentially to give the extra money to UNI and ISU, and in that way hold University of Iowa harmless. Maybe you can rally the supporters of UI behind that. I'm not sure, but it's a lot of money, and the Republicans in the House don't like to spend money very much, and they have demonstrated that they don't like to spend it on higher ed. So I'm a little skeptical of that. I mean, I'm hopeful. I know that our students and our lobbyists are going to work hard to make it happen. And there might be there's probably a role for faculty and staff to play as well to make it happen. But it's an uphill battle, I would say. The other thing I would say is that the problem is that the Democrats in the Senate, who are normally supportive of giving additional money for higher ed, don't like the performance-based part of the model very much, especially those Democrats who are from the eastern part of the state that have a lot of affinity for the University of Iowa. So some people who are kind of our normal political allies are a little bit skeptical, and so the question is sort of, I guess sometimes when you look across the country, sometimes conservatives who don't like to spend money, they're sometimes more likely to spend it if it's couched in the language of accountability. And that might be what the regents are after here. That's probably part of the strategy for this, is the hope that they can get that additional funding that the universities need by pitching it to the legislature in a way that they're getting more accountability and results for their money.
I have a question. How is it that this discrepancy happened in the first place? Does it really take that much more money to educate University of Iowa students? Is it because of the medical school or the law school or the engineering? We don't have much engineering.
I don't know why. I mean, there's that one slide that shows the UI and ISU parting ways back, I don't know where, back around like late 1980s, early 1990s, they really start to deviate from one another, and then in recent years it's gone even more so. I can tell you that in recent years, the reason that the per pupil funding favors UI so much is that they've cut back on their in-state students. Over the last, let's see, I don't know if I have the numbers right in front of me, but over the last 5-6 years, the University of Iowa has grown by a total of somewhere, I think, around 3,000 students, 3,000 undergrads, somewhere in that neighborhood. But they actually have fewer in-state students than they did 5 or 6 years ago. So they've basically cut back on in-state students, recruited more out-of-state students, and so what they're doing is they've got more state revenues per in-state student, and they've got the additional out-of-state tuition. And so I think that explains the steep rise in UI's ratio, so to speak, over the last, say, 5 years. But I don't know what explains the previous 10.
Along that same line, I guess, is there any benefit to sort of parsing this out between undergrads, grad students, professional students, med, law, dentistry? Because the costs for all those are different, and say like a grad student in the sciences typically has a stipend or they're TAing, and it's different in the humanities. Is there any use in parsing that out a little bit more?
University of Iowa definitely thinks there is. But I mean, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure, I mean, I guess, yes, there are different costs, but also as you compare to the undergraduate population, there's a lot fewer of those students.
Right.
So I don't really know the, population of University of Iowa that well, and maybe they would like to do that kind of study to show something, but I don't think it's that big of an impact, mainly because there's far fewer medical students than, say, marketing students. So.
That's expensive too, business, being in business professors.
Sure.
And then they're recruiting international students and then out-of-state students. Some of them are coming from Illinois, like from the Chicago area, because that system's suffering. So, I don't know, I just want to know why it happened in the first place.
They have better lobbyists?
Huh?
They have better
Well,
lobbyists.
I will say that just 1 second, Joe. I will say that it's occurred to me as I've been kind of enmeshed in this over the last few days getting ready for this, that we're talking a lot right now about how U of I is getting more aggressive right now, more aggressive in terms of recruiting students, but just generally more aggressive in its marketing posture and its kind of political posture toward the other universities. But when you look at slides like the one that show the discrepancy in per pupil funding, and the fact that 46 cents out of every dollar goes to U of I, part of me starts to think, well, it's possible maybe they've been being quite aggressive on this for a long time, but we're just now noticing. And so that's another way to think of it too. I confess I'm not comfortable with this sort of with that kind of competitive relationships that this new model seems to encourage. On the other hand, it's a competitive marketplace. Even before this model, Iowa State has been extremely competitive in recruiting students, and we know we've lost a lot of students to Iowa State over the last few years. So, maybe this is just the world we live in now.
Well, I mean, that was going to be my comment. I mean, if you just think about the conversation that we're having now, I mean, this conversation is going to be a conversation of sort of actuarial accounting models for thinking about, how do we attract students and how do we keep students, as opposed to what is the university's mission, right? Once you get into once we start going down this path, it seems to me that every department on this campus is going to eventually be pressed to perform on numbers related to the way in which it's producing revenue. I don't see how you get out of that eventually. I don't see how you get away from that eventually. And if that's the kind of university we all want, well then so be it. But I think we should be pretty skeptical about it. Again, I'm on the horns of a dilemma here because I know we need the money. But I think we should all be thinking not just about the short-term consequences, oh, that nice shiny object, right? We should be thinking about what this means 10 years down the line. 15, 20 years, what does this mean to, education at this university?
With all the examples that are negative from universities having tried this performance-based funding, that seems to me to be a strong reason that it really is not a good long-term solution. And apparently it's been tried over in the United Kingdom before this, and they have really had problems.
Well, I don't know about negative examples in the United States with the exception of the South Carolina model. But that was version 1.0. This is a different version now. It's a more, I don't know how to say it, but it's a more formalized, rationalized version. But the problem here is that We don't know, we can't say good news or bad news about version 2.0. I'm just saying, I don't understand, thinking as an economist, how this model moves forward without eventually putting pressure on whether you're in the music program or the psychology program or you're teaching an anthropology program, that eventually this gets to be a model of, if you want to keep your program alive, you better produce the numbers. And if numbers don't reach a certain level, then bang, your program's
And we saw
gone.
how much trouble we got into with that when programs were slashed.
That's right.
That took all those people to Iowa State to complete their degree.
That's right. I mean, if you recall, fiscal rationales is for the fiscal explanations were the reasons for job cuts and program eliminations a few years ago. This is just a more, I want to be careful. We have to be concerned that this is how would one say, a more sophisticated version of a similar process, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is the intent. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me here. In fact, when people critique performance-based funding, their critique is always what? Unintended consequences. Unintended consequences.
I would say too that we should keep a couple things in mind. I mean, first of all, let's say this goes through as the regents have proposed. Okay, so we're looking at an additional $20 million roughly over 3 years. Now, the first year of that, as we explained earlier, is basically filling in the hole that we're going to be in next year if we don't get any additional funding. So we'd be netting 14 million or so over 2 years. That would be a huge influx of revenue to us, and that's to our base. Everything from there then goes on the base, and you'd have to lose a lot of students. Our enrollment would have to go way down.
About 20%.
We have to go down 20%, is that what you said? In order to be equivalent to where we are right now. So, I mean, we have to kind of keep in perspective, if it were to go through and we were to get the additional funding, the situation would be, I think the pressures Joe identifies are correct. I think we would be under those pressures as programs. On the other hand, those pressures might operate differently in a context of stable budgets than they did in the context of huge cuts to budgets, right? In the context of stable budgets, the pressure might be, look, if you're going to get additional resources, you're going to have to show that you're growing. Whereas in the context of huge cuts, it's, justify your life kind of thing. So I don't know. Like Joe said, it's hard to know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. And one of the things President Root frequently says, that we can count on with the economy is going to go up, it's going to go down. He's absolutely correct. So what happens when we go into those troughs, right? Are we fighting for our life? So, but I appreciate the calculations that, we'd have to have like a 20% dip once this model is in place. But, where are we right now? About 12 grand for our student or special. I remember at a time when we were pretty close to 14, right? So it's not as if, and part of what you have to, maybe it's just my strategic orientation to policy and things. I mean, I try to think ahead of the curve, and I am not at all seduced by the notion that the University of Iowa and ISU's extremely aggressive marketing campaign will not have implications for our enrollment. I don't,
Here's the thing about,
You have a question?
I was actually just going to make the point that we've watched these budgets get cut repeatedly. So the notion that this money will come into our base budget is irrelevant. It's always, in a sense, one-time money. Every dime they give us is always one-time
Good
money.
question. What is a base?
They can cut that as much as they want year after year after year. And if you've been here since 1989, you've watched this yo-yoing, but we go up, but then we drop way back down. We don't seem to be able to really recover the kind of support for students, regardless of this redistribution formula, which will be more equitable, perhaps. We have not seen any kind of interest in returning the kind of really strong support for funding undergraduate or graduate education because, I mean, we used to pay, what, 70%, the state paid 70 to 80% of the costs of an education? And now they're down to 40,
I would say
45, 50. And that's not gonna get better.
This is, I don't know how to ask this, so it's going to come across as probably naive or stupid question, but why are we presuming this is going to be a long-term solution when in the past nothing has ever lasted for more than a couple of years? I mean, as you pointed out, the legislature is going to do what they want to do anyway. Is this really going to last long-term, or is this just another one of those great ideas that'll last a couple of years and then we'll be on to a new model? I'm just trying to get a sense of.
The rosy scenario, the rosy scenario.
But you know, in some ways, I actually think the best scenario, honestly, would be that this passes more or less the way the regents think it would, that there are a lot of troubles with it, and 5 years from now, a new board of regents says, you know, that was a whole bunch of trouble, and it didn't really improve our graduation rate, and it didn't really improve this, and it didn't really improve that. So let's just go back to base plus. But now we're at the new base.
But see, we could,
Okay.
but we could do that.
And
now.
so, no, I mean, I understand we could, but given the political kinds of things I
So
talked
what-
about
so-
earlier.
So what Scott's referring to in corporate world is referred to as constructive destruction. But the problem between now and then is there's a lot of blood on the floor, okay? That's the problem. And so what I said earlier, and I think this is something I hope everyone really keeps in mind, and because I think this is going to happen, notwithstanding the possibilities of the legislature having problems with it, and I could be, who knows? No one has a crystal ball. But if it does happen, I believe it places enormous responsibility on the faculty senate, and that means the faculty to be capable and vigilant guardians of the quality of our curriculum and our program. You know, United Faculty, we have a specific mission. You know, we're academic freedom, tenure, wages, conditions of work, benefits. These guys over here and their predecessors, they're about protecting the quality of our program. And so if this happens, all of us are going to have to, I think, adopt a new posture about how we protect academics on this campus.
Jeff? I think we're discussing this in terms of everything related to the regents' support or opposition to this. But I think it's also critical to note that two of the groups that are really opposed to this performance funding in terms of rewarding money for a head count on in-state students are the private colleges, and increasingly the community colleges, who are seeing this as them being the ones taking the big hit if the three regents start recruiting heavily for undergrads.
Which also,
Really think that what we're seeing here is not going to be what comes out the other end.
So you're saying they'll be in the legislature working against
Absolutely.
it as well?
yep, definitely. And they're in a lot of legislative districts around the state. When you add up the community colleges and the private colleges, I mean, I don't even know how many legislative districts. It's got to be most of them.
So perhaps we could just bargain for a percentage like Joe brought up as a solution, while we're also under this gun with the Board of Regents to have this Deloitte evaluation at all three universities. So it's like double whammy when that's not going to be completed for a certain number of years.
So here's my other fear on Deloitte is that if I'm a Republican in the House and the regents come to me and ask me for $12 million additional dollars, I'm going to say, wait a second, you just told me that your Deloitte study saved you however many tens of millions of dollars. Why do I need to come up with more money for you? So that's my other worry
Which sounds
about
good,
this.
which sounds good, but then you're back to the problem of the three university presidents wanting to fight over those savings.
Now, the fact is that those savings, if they're ever realized,
right.
aren't going to be realized for years.
That's
But
right.
state legislators aren't always easy to convince about things like that. And when the regents have kind of, sold this as saving a lot of money, I kind of fear that it might come back to bite us a little
They
bit.
spend a lot of money to do it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Question, observation, I don't know how you want to put it, but at some point, there's supposedly accountability for the performance space. At what point are board regents or the legislature going to start talking about what should be the optimal size of what the student body should be based upon the campus facilities that you currently have? Because not everybody, when ISU is basically paying freshmen $100 to not, or $1,000 not to live on campus as we don't have room for you. At what point did you grow too much? And should that actually be a negative, because now you can't actually accommodate the student body that you're trying to get? And also with Iowa, I mean, how much of the shift in their undergraduate population had something to do with the flooding that actually occurred on the campus as well? I mean, they couldn't, for a while, they didn't have academic buildings, so you can't grow if you don't have facilities.
No, they have grown
for
though.
students
They've,
that live
yeah,
there.
I mean, they have 3,000 more students than they did before the floods.
Yeah, but I mean, still, I think that changed how they thought about what they were gonna have. But, at what point do they say, you know what, you can't grow anymore because you don't have the facilities for it?
But
You
you know-
don't have the money to build the facilities
Oh, I'm
for it.
Just,
Or
just,
space for it.
I'm not sure if the Board of Regents wants to get involved in detail with that, just from having talked to a
No,
couple.
no.
But they do have that as a consideration for, they've, in conversations I've had with Bob Donnelly, it's about, you guys need to decide how many students you really want to have. And you and I, do you want to have 15,000, 14,000? That's something that you and I need
But
to.
then you can't penalize a university for deciding that this is the optimal size in terms of budgeting decisions then. So ISU grows another 6,000 students, all of a sudden we're like left holding the bag.
Well, it's not necessarily a reward or a penalty, it's just a percentage.
But can I just make a quick comment to that? A lot of us read, about trends that are happening nationwide in terms of enrollment management, stuff like that. And I will just tell you, I think that, in my view, is the notion that the Board of Regents is ever going to say, at least in the near-term future, say, well, yeah, let's have a cap in enrollment, or let's set up an enrollment center. I just don't see that as realistic. I mean, the whole drive toward enrollment management throughout this country, and especially in public sector schools, is to see students as a form of revenue and to get in as many of them as you can. I mean,
get
that's
that,
just
if
the
we're-
reality.
If we are to be the guardians of quality education, we have to be able to educate those students.
I agree 100%. That's why these kind of models are going to place a new responsibility, I think, upon faculty to be more vigilant as being those guardians.
I want to ask a question about the debt service, because that was, for me, the most interesting piece, actually, that I hadn't seen before. I would presume that this is because we've taken out bond issues to build dorms, to renovate buildings, et cetera. Is that?
Well, Mike can talk to that better than I can, but there are a lot of reasons for debt. I probably, you're correct. I mean, there are dorms, we didn't drill down that deep into this.
But it's eating a big chunk of the budget.
I'm sorry?
Dormitories are not included in general.
There you go. So, Mike could probably tell us better what all this debt is about. I don't really know. I'm not, but.
I don't think it's having a big impact on the general fund budget, but we can certainly get some more information on that. I'm wondering if you can show Tim slide 3 again real quick. I think that's almost, can I use the word damning?
Sure.
I think that's the biggest slide in the presentation.
Is that done with the tuition and the appropriation?
So just there.
Yeah.
This is just my own personal opinion. I need to be careful when I'm not arguing on the university path. It's my own personal opinion. And this is a slide that the board office put together for a Board of Regents meeting last month. If you see the 3 lines there, Board of Regents is the bottom line, the blue line. The Department of Education is red, state government, minus the regents, is green, and community colleges are purple. Sad choice of color, but nonetheless. So you can see the ups and downs in the state budget, but what's happened to the regent universities from a funding perspective. And so I think that if we recognize, I think this is kind of what you're saying earlier, Melissa, that there's going to be ups and downs, and we live with that along with the other state agencies and other parts of the state. But if the regents have continually been losing appropriations, I think this is the biggest problem for all 3 universities, and in particular UNI, because we have not had the benefit of out-of-state tuition as the other 2 do. That's kind of what started this whole discussion about 4 or 5 years ago. So what I'm going to be doing personally is lobbying my legislators for more funding for our higher education in general, and I think we will benefit from that as an institution in the long run.
Yeah, I just have to agree, Michael, that's something, you know, if you look at the universities, I don't know if you can see the numbers up there, my eyes are kind of weak, but it's down 20% for the four universities, and up 30 to 40% for everybody else. So that up 30 to 40% represents inflation. So basically they're keeping up with the normal cost of living, et cetera, where the universities are way down in terms of their prospective funding. And I keep thinking some microphones, I'm sorry if I talk low, I think it's like blasting things out of use.
Yeah, and I would just say one more thing and quickly. If we focus on Iowa and Iowa's increased attention to in-state students, Michael mentioned the out-of-state revenue that the other universities get, particularly the University of Iowa. And the thing is that right now, University of Iowa is under intense pressure to get more in-state students, not only through this model, but also through, in my opinion, unfortunate comments that members of the Board of Regents have made that have really devalued the role that the University of Iowa plays as a major research university that does great things for the state by bringing out-of-state students into the state. That's an important role for the state. But if we look at Iowa's long-term interests, their long-term interests are not in replacing out-of-state students with in-state students. If my calculations are right, the marginal value of each undergraduate based on this proposed model is about $6,000. Okay, that is, each additional undergraduate gets you about $6,000 of additional money from the state. Is that about right? Does that sound right? By contrast, out-of-state tuition is $18,000. All right? It makes no sense for the University of Iowa long-term. Short-term, they've got a public image problem and a regents problem they have to rectify. Long-term, it makes no sense for them to replace out-of-state students with in-state students. Now, the other alternative is to go the Iowa State route and just grow like crazy, right? But I'm not even sure that University of Iowa can handle that. When you go on their campus now, they've already got so much construction that it's hard to imagine how much more construction they could do to fit in a whole ton of new students. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's going to be, they're coming on strongly. It's, you know, they're coming on kind of ferociously. But long term, is it in their interest to keep that up? There was a hand.
When is the legislature taking this up?
In the session that starts in January and ends in when they end, I guess. Usually they end in April, something like that.
There was discussion yesterday, the Legislative Fiscal Committee met yesterday down in Iowa City, and there was some discussion about this at that committee meeting yesterday already.
Hey, Michael, can I ask you a question? Why do you say that the $22, $23 million a year that's spent on debt service doesn't have an impact on the budget? That's sort of heard you say.
It doesn't impact on the general fund budget.
Right.
Like it would impact residents because they borrowed money, and so that impacts room and board, but there's no tuition, there's no state appropriations that go to residents.
But it's part of you and I's budget expenditure, right? It's part of how we spend money. So it's money that might otherwise be available for other spending priorities.
Yeah.
Why is that not the case?
Room and board money can't be, the money that DOR is using for room and board comes from students paying rent. That can be used for the bonds, it can't be used for utilities.
So you're saying the bonds are paid by student resident fees?
Yeah, on the residence bonds, yeah.
But we don't, but.
I think your total, I think where it stems from is when your total debt that you're talking about, the 23 or 24 million, and you made a comment that included or the residence halls. And Jean was just stating that the amount of debt that our residence system has is separate from the debt the university has for academic and administrative buildings. And so the money that the residence system, the way we pay back our debt is through room and board, what we charge students for living on campus and eating on campus.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't answer the question, but I didn't know what that debt was attached to. I didn't know, that's why.
Yeah, I don't know what I imagine it's administrative and academic buildings.
And then on those.
Buildings,
where
administrative.
There's bonds, the legislature gives us a straight appropriation to pay for it. It doesn't come out of the general fund appropriation.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, this might sound like semantics, but how specifically did the board send the request to the legislature? What did they specifically ask the legislature to do?
To approve the request for, I think it's just the requests per institution, plus the 1.75, plus the additional 12.9. I think that's the only way that the request has gone to the legislature. Now, along with that request, I assume they have a justification for how they got to those numbers, and that justification is the performance-based funding formulas.
Okay, so it's not like a package that the performance-based funding really.
The legislature doesn't have to approve performance-based funding per se.
It's asking for a specific increase to UNI and Iowa State, sort of getting put in the middle again, basically, is what's happening.
Yeah, a specific allocation or appropriation for each
Well, that's
institution.
a good question. So let me just get this straight. So what the board will do is go forward asking for enough money from the legislature, which will be an increase over the previous year, so as to fund the performance-based model, right?
Yes.
Right. And that's it, and that's gonna be, and then what'll happen is the legislature will fight about whether or not they think that's a good way to spend the money.
Right. I had a question in the back.
As far as the 10% for access for low income, you know how that's broken up? Because for the financial lead, they said you can't be duplicated, but for all the other categories, you could have somebody that's in every one of those categories, that they hit every single one. And so are they only counted once, or are they actually counted for each category, that they are a transfer student that happens to be a minority and a veteran and a youth?
Oh, that came up before.
It's a good question, and I don't know, Bruce or Michael, do you know the answer to that?
I'm not sure I can look that up. I better not say which way it is, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think they can be counted in multiple categories.
Yeah, I don't see anything. I've got the actual Board of Regents item here in front of me. And it does talk about how people can't be double counted for financial need, but it doesn't talk about double counting across the different categories there, so I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, so I was just wondering, like, the 10%, if it's 2% for each category then, or is it 10% for the whole?
And that I don't know either.
Okay.
I thought it was just straight up number, but I'm not positive.
So maybe is it a total number of students who falls into one of those categories? Is that how it would be calculated perhaps?
I'm not sure about the double counting, but it's definitely, it's a number of students, I believe.
If this gets approved, do you think that this will force us to change our strategic plan as a university and start taking into account all these performance measures into our
Yes.
strategic plan?
Yeah.
And are there plans to do something like that at the faculty level and at the administration level?
We're already starting, the president has kind of a different model of strategic planning. Multiple strategic plans dealing with particular areas of the university. So we're already starting soon anyway, the development of the next academic master plan. There's a facilities master plan that's being developed, an enrollment management master plan. So obviously that's gonna be key there. Is there something else? So at least those three. And then the question of how all those master plans fit together, that I don't know. That's a question that I have not had a chance to ask yet, but we'll be asking about how you actually get all, because the goal is, I mean, if you're gonna plan facilities, you need to plan it in concert with the plan for how many students you're gonna have on campus and what your academic areas that you're pursuing are gonna be.
But I think it also will affect, and this is part of what a discussion we were having yesterday, and this does fit on with the strategic planning part, but it also affects, how we envision UNI as a university, as a comprehensive university, which really has implications for how we envision the role of the faculty. So, I mean, we're having some of those discussions now, but about how we incentivize promotion and so on. And I could certainly see how this will, resonate into those decisions in the future. But how that will be, it's really hard to say.
Laura, did you have another question?
No, sorry. Because the vote as to whether performance-based funding, the regions model is going to happen is in November, correct?
Regions have passed performance-based
Right.
funding.
Okay.
Right.
It's gone, it's already,
So it's a done deal, so the only question is whether the legislature will
Yeah.
fund it at the level that they want to fund, that the regions want to fund it.
well,
at.
right, I mean, I guess the question would be, what if the legislature comes back and just says, nope, we're just gonna fund each university at their current levels plus, 1.75%? Do the regions then stick to the performance-based measures or not? I mean, that's, who knows at that point, right? So,
But there isn't a question as to whether performance-based funding is going forward.
No,
It is at this
yeah,
point.
absolutely.
That is their plan. It's
Yep.
just whether the legislature is going to approve the appropriation.
yep.
Okay. The only other question I have, is there anybody from the business college here? Because I just found a student's wallet with credit cards and everything in it. I didn't check for cash, but, there isn't going to be an office that I can drop this off at. It
Like
just-
the University Police.
Okay, because it was, I just happened to look down and I'm like, oh, there's a wallet, there's a credit card, cash card, and a student ID, so you can pick
I'll
it.
just make a comment, it's not a question. I came in thinking this, we're going to understand performance. In this case, I think about performance indicators as quality of the program, number of graduates. It seems a very small percent. It seems more like an enrollment plan. In this case, a strategy for increasing enrollment. And if it's true that we double dip or triple dip, ours going to change our enrollment strategy, which ultimately would say we're going to go for community colleges, minorities with military background. Again, here through 2 years, so that really impacts our mission, I think, about a four-year comprehensive school. So I just think we kind of have to reflect on that a little bit. That was my comment.
Yeah, I mean, are there do you have any advice for us about how we engage the regions on these issues? I mean, is this,
Yeah, my rebuttal, or if I could stand up and say it to them, is that, we represent an entity in the state that represents a four-year comprehensive mission. And there are community colleges that fulfill missions that are 2 year, in 1 or 2 years. There are research ones, which we are not, which really hit graduate and doctoral programs with external funding as a primary source for that. And of course, the question is what kind of experience we want these students to come to campus for. Not to eliminate distance education, but the point being is that we want them here to, service them. And that's my bias. So I would be just refraining to say, listen, we just don't want to deal with enrollment. We can go out and compete with the streets. But the question would be, will that enhance our quality and ensure our mission as a comprehensive school?
It's so important what you're saying, and when you read the research, we always hear this term best practices thrown around. It's one of my least favorite terms, but what the research is saying, and you saw it in this PowerPoint, what researchers are saying about this is that where you have performance-based funding, the metrics should be tailored to the university mission. That's not what we have here. We have a very one-size-fits-all approach, and that's a little disconcerting to me.
The thing I noticed is we're seeing writ large the same problems we experienced here 2 years ago. A proposal comes down with no consultation to the people who it's actually going to affect. With us, it was the program cuts 2 years ago. Now it's the reallocation of funding, and there's been negligible consultation with the people affected. This time, we are apparently benefiting in the short term, but the fundamental problem in how decisions are being made is the same. And I think that's a point that it's worth noting and raising with the Board of Regents and with the legislature is, we lost one, we sort of were winning one on the dollar side, but we're not necessarily happy with the way decisions are being made, and it's going to cause problems down the track. Like with the program cuts, we more than lost in what we lost in students is the way the procedure was handled, than we saved by cutting. And there's the same danger with unintended consequences. So I think we've got an example of unintended consequences when there's not consultation with people who have relevant information. We saw what damage that can do. Let's think this through about the long-term consequences and unintended effects. I think that's a possible way of approaching it. We're probably the best position to say that because we're the ones who look to gain in the short term from this proposal.
You know, in terms of what you just said, to me, you're speaking to the choir, okay? I mean, you really are, and I think this is kind of like a redux, you know, in terms of what happened 2 years ago. It's just a more sophisticated, slower burn. You know, that's my concern, right? And I will say that, yes, you know, Bob Donnelly or the regents might speak to Tom or Scott or to me, but there has not been an effort to do as the research says should be done when initiated performance-based funding, and that's to really incorporate in a structural way, you know, the stakeholders. And the faculty are stakeholders, students are stakeholders in this. So, you know, university, student government should be involved in this, so from all three universities. So, you know, and I tell you, when I take a look at the list of bad administrative decisions that I've seen in the past few years, either from the Board of Regents or in this university, you know, it does not inspire a lot of confidence in me that this is all going to work out really well. I have to tell you, it really doesn't. I'm anxious about it, all right? But, you know, there is that money, you know, and as a union president, I want that money. I want that money for you, for your benefits and salary. So and then I have to tell you, I'm going to say something else. It's really disturbing to me also that more faculty are not paying attention or are not involved in this. This is a pretty scarce turnout for this event, and this is what we're getting ready to have is a radical departure in funding models for our university. And you know, we gave a lot of notice to this meeting. Everybody on this panel put a lot of work into it, and I'm happy we did. You know, it's great for Scott to set it up, but you know. Now maybe it's just because there's a tremendous exhaustion on the part of the faculty with everything we've been through the past few years. I mean, I think we're still culturally wounded from that. But, you know, we're going to have to rise above it probably at some point.
As I think about, you know, how we should respond to this and the faculty, what kinds of actions we should take, I think that the regents did us a favor, at least, with the addition of the extra request for money, so that U of I, if it would be granted, U of I would not have its budget cut. U of I would stay at its current level, and money would be appropriated, additional money would be appropriated to us, consistent with the formula, because that allows us to push for, as Michael said, more money for higher ed, without looking like we're pushing for, yeah, stick it to Iowa, which I don't think anyone on the faculty wants, right? I mean, I've spent 3 summers at the University of Iowa, actually. 1 as a patient in their hospital, unfortunately, but 2 as you know, with my wife, who teaches at Wartburg, was there on a summer fellowship, and we moved our family down there for the summer, 2 different summers. I have a lot of respect for University of Iowa. It's, like I said earlier, it's a great asset to the state. But at the same time, I think we know as faculty members at UNI that the current funding situation is not tenable. It's not sustainable. We can't plan. We can't make these plans. We have a president who I think genuinely wants to engage the campus to make plans and to look forward. It's hard to do when you're in a hole. It's hard to do when you don't have any funds or flexibility in your budget. U of I and ISU have more flexibility in their budget. I think one thing that came out, Michael or Bruce can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one thing that came out of this whole thing is that U of I has something close to $1 billion in cash reserves. And some of that's probably committed to particular things, but that's a lot of cash reserves to have sitting around. They have huge foundations, which of course we don't have. And again, some of that's committed to different things. They can't just take one thing and spend it in another place, but it gives them financial flexibility that we just don't have as a smaller institution, and their grant dollars, yeah. And so the positive thing, if we can get the additional funding, is that this would at least give us that kind of flexibility in our budget to do some planning and you know, really plan for the future.
This is going to sound like a self-serving comment, so I'll own that up front, but I would respectfully disagree, Joe, that this is a part two from what we 2 years ago. We've got a very different president, a very different provost than what we had 2 years ago. And so I think I worry that that comes across as a scare tactic, and I had just started my current role back when those decisions were made. I don't see any of the same, from where I'm sitting, I don't see any of the same behaviors or lack of engagement or lack of desire as what I saw back then. And so for what it's worth,
Well, it's always been an empirical question, the troubles of 2012, Michael. It's always been an empirical question, the troubles of 2012. Did they originate from the board or did they originate from the UNI administration? So, yeah, that's right. So my comment is to say that when I look at the long range of just the list of decisions that have been made in the past few years, and I'm not including President Root in this. I said the other day at the faculty meeting, as far as I'm concerned, in his first year, you know, President Root has demonstrated to me he's the best president we've had since I've been here. So I'm not saying that. But most of a big bunch of the decisions that are made at the board level. And they've not been good. There've been some really bad decisions. And in fact, the decision to, you know, the reason why we have a new administration now is largely because of the faculty. The faculty pushed that. So it's kind of like when you take a look at the problems that we've had on this campus, you can trace their origins to the Board of Regents. You look at the solutions, you can trace them to the faculty. So, you know, now I want to say too, I mean, I have a lot of respect for the Board of Regents. It might not sound like, but they do a lot. They have a tough job. You know, I understand they have a tough job, but you know, they're probably understaffed. They probably don't have enough policy analysts and people to help them with some of their choices. I don't know. But all I'm pointing out is that, you know, it is what it is. There have been a lot of bad decisions that have affected this university over the past few years, and that doesn't inspire me with a lot of confidence about how this is going to work out.
Thank you for the clarification.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much for coming.